Can we thank the worship band, including Colin Bryan up here tonight? Beautifully done, beautifully prayed. That was all wonderful. Thank you all. I'm excited about tonight. This is the fourth community night we've had in this first round of the Foundry gatherings. But I'm particularly excited about tonight because of the person standing next to me. This is Reverend Becca McNitzky. She works at a nonprofit here in town called Magdalena House, which is a shelter for women and their children fleeing domestic violence or sex trafficking. And she is the education and the outreach coordinator for Magdalena House. So she goes around telling people about what Mag House is. She helps the mothers get involved in their degree programs and help them graduate so that they can start life anew on the right foot. That's all wonderful, but what's most wonderful about her is that I get to live with her and spend every day of my life with her. This is my wife, so I'm particularly excited that she said yes to lead us tonight, not just be a part of it. Becca's usually not here on Tuesday nights because she's leading something at Magdalena House every Tuesday at 6:30 p.m., but this Tuesday just happened to be off for her, so I said, why not lead us instead? Keep working, right? So Becca, do you want to say anything more than some of the things I've covered? Talk about your family, where you're from, or anything like that? Okay, she doesn't want to do that. She's saving it all for the message she's about to give. Well, then, without further ado, Becca, we want to ask you the question of the day. If you could choose any time period in history to live in, which one would you choose and why?
I didn't have a good answer to this. I feel like I never have a good answer to these questions. But I said the 1920s because I think it'd be really fun to be a flapper and do the Charleston. Oh, and our friend Chanson's here and she's a swing dancer. So she would do well in the 20s. Okay, so I'll bring it to the present, to the 2020s.
There you go. Well, we're excited that you're spending your time here with us tonight and that you're going to lead us into understanding what God has for us in this particular lesson, which is, what does it mean? We're in a series on identity, and tonight's lesson is, what does it mean to be a human being at this point in the world's history right now? So, can we welcome Becca right now? Thanks, Becca.
Well, when Reed and Sarah first asked me to talk tonight, I thought they would give me an easy topic, a softball, and of course you heard the question, what does it mean to be a human right now? I don't know. I guess that's why they couldn't find anyone else with that question, right? But I'm really glad to be with y'all tonight and to actually be back in person. I was here for the first one, but I haven't been back. I've just been watching online, so it's good to see everyone. So that question, what does it mean to be a human at this point in history? It's a really tough one. But as I thought about it more, it reminded me of a story in the Bible, in particular, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight. So tonight we're going to be looking at the Book of Esther, which I feel like we don't talk about very much. But Esther is in the Old Testament, and it's one of only 2 books in the whole Bible who are named after a woman. And I'm going to do a little bit of background and get us up to speed on Esther. So if you're not familiar with the story, by the way, it's a really short book, and you can knock it out really fast, and it's pretty good. There's action, there's violence, there's kingdom far away. It's a really good story. So I recommend reading it when you get home. But the book takes place in the Persian capital city of Susa. So if you're thinking about all of Israel, the timeline of Israel, this is pretty late in the timeline. So Israel has already been divided into Israel and Judah, and they've been conquered by the Babylonians, by the Assyrians, and now we're with the Persians. And actually the book of Esther doesn't even take place in the Promised Land. It's actually far away in the Persian Empire. So that's where we're going to be looking at today. So here's what you need to know before we dig in. Esther is a Jewish woman who's living in Persia, and she was raised not by her own parents, but by her cousin Mordecai. So that's a name to remember, Esther, Mordecai. Mordecai is a faithful Jewish man. He's kind of the person who gives Esther advice when she needs it. And so in the very beginning of the book of Esther, Esther finds herself in this new position of power in this faraway kingdom, and that is Esther becomes the queen of Persia. She marries the King Xerxes, and if you want to read more, it's like a bachelor-style love story. That's Esther 1 and 2. Tune in. So anyway, Esther finds herself as the queen of Persia, and on her way to becoming that, Mordecai's advice to her is don't tell anyone that you're a Jew. Don't tell anyone you're a minority. Don't tell them about your culture. Keep that quiet, and that'll serve you better in the long run. So nobody knows that she's Jewish. And what happens, the long and short of it is, in the book of Esther, while she's queen, an edict goes out to the kingdom, and the king signs it, he puts a seal on it, and it basically says that all the Jews living in the Persian Empire are going to be annihilated. They're going to be killed. They're going to be wiped out. That's what the law of the land is now. And this is all the work of an evil guy named Haman. So you're going to hear that whenever we start reading. But it is the king, it's Esther's husband who signs this into law. And so Esther's people are facing this being wiped out. So we're going to look today in chapter 4. If you have your little Bible apps, you can whip it out. And we're going to start with verse 1 of chapter 4. So remember, Esther, queen. Mordecai is the cousin, also Jewish. I think that's most of the names. So beginning in chapter 4. When Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went out into the city wailing loudly and bitterly. Going to verse 3. In every province to which the edict and order of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's eunuchs and female attendants came and told her about Mordecai, she was in great distress. She sent clothes for him to put on instead of his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs assigned to attend her, and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate, and Mordecai told him everything that had happened. Verse 8, he also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for the Jewish annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show to Esther and to explain it to her. And he told him to instruct her to go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Hathach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, all the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death, unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? Who knows that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? So that's the phrase that I heard in the question for the night. What does it mean to be a human in such a time as this? I think there are a lot of different ways, if we think about our present context, that we could describe what that means. A time such as a global pandemic where there's been almost 5 million deaths worldwide. A time such as this when technology is changing the way that we work and think, and loneliness is at an all-time high. A time such as this when mental health crises are on the rise. A time such as this when we are exploiting the earth's resources at a more rapid rate than ever. A time such as this when it seems that we will never be rid of blatant injustice and prejudice in our society. But the story of Esther provides an example for us. So going back to the setting of Esther, we said it's set in the Persian Empire. But to be more specific, that means that all of the Jews that we're hearing about in this story are immigrants. And they are doing their best to turn into your fourth grade social studies mind to assimilate. Do you remember that word? Assimilation isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it becomes a balancing act, a fine line to walk. Assimilation for immigrants becomes the question of how much do I need to do in order to survive in this new culture? So we see it today when we think about code switching or passing, right? It still happens every single day for immigrants, this idea of assimilation. And that's what's happening in Esther. The new queen decides that for her well-being, she has to conceal her Jewish identity. In fact, to drill this point home, in all of the Bible, the book of Esther stands out because it is the only book that does not explicitly mention God. God is not named. There is no Torah. There are no rituals. There is no temple. Esther does not explicitly talk about God at all. But that just hones in on the culture of the book of Esther all the more. Because the absence of God in Esther is another sign of the world that she's living in. She's not in Israel anymore. But I think this is why Esther makes such a good book for us to talk about tonight. Because in so many ways, we have assimilated to the largely secular world in which we live. The waters that we swim in are not explicitly Christian, right? I mean, everyone here who goes to work or goes to school, I'm sure y'all would agree with that, right? You're probably largely in the secular world every day. But Mordecai, in the passage that we read tonight, reminds Esther that maybe her culture actually does matter in this situation. Maybe her ethnicity is the whole reason that she's been put in a position of power in the first place. Through Mordecai, God reminds Esther and us to remember who we are, our traditions, our faith, our people, and to live out of our true identity, which, let me tell you, my identity is not what you see right now. My identity is not that I'm Becca McNitzky, that I have brown hair and I have white skin and I'm wearing a yellow dress. That's not my true identity, right? My primary identity, the identity that comes before all of those things, is the one that I was given at my baptism. It's the one that you were given at your baptism. It's the one that says that you are a beloved child of God. And if we can recall that, if we can act and live out of that identity, then we can take anything that the world throws at us. Now, I'm not going to go too much more deeply into the book of Esther, but I want to tell you, in case you're worrying, it does turn out okay. Happy ending. Esther bravely risks her life, and she approaches the king and makes her case before him and pleads on behalf of her people against their genocide. And he relents, he gives in. And so these people that she now claims live. So what does it mean to be human, to be a Christian in a world riddled by trouble? It's what Queen Esther shows us. She's able to rightly see herself in a people that are doomed to destruction. What saves the Jews in this story? It's empathy. In a world that's riddled with shame, with guilt, with pointing fingers, with divisiveness, it's empathy that saves us. There's an old story about a teacher and his disciples. And in it, the teacher asks the disciples, how can we know when the darkness is gone and the dawn is coming? How can we know when the darkness is gone and the dawn is coming? And the disciples sit and think quietly for a bit. And finally, one of them raises their hand and says, "We can know that the darkness is gone and the dawn is coming when we can look out and see a tree way off. And we can tell that it's an elm tree, not a juniper." And then someone else raises their hand and says, "I think we can know that the darkness is gone and the light is coming when we can see that it's a fox and not a wolf." But the old teacher looks at them and says, "No, those things are not going to help us." And so they say, "Well, what is it? What is it that tells us that the darkness is going and the dawn is coming?" And the teacher replies, "We can know that darkness is leaving and the dawn is coming when we can see one person and know that it's our brother or our sister. For otherwise, no matter what time it is, it's still dark." This is empathy. It's what Dinah and Adam talked about when they talked about the creation story a few weeks ago. If God created us in the image of God's own self, then it's through empathy, it's through seeing God in us that God saves us. It's through empathy that Jesus takes on our flesh. So empathy is Esther's motive, but it's courage that enables her to act. Courage isn't something we often talk about in church very much, but throughout church history, it was considered one of the most important virtues. In fact, some people said it was the most important virtues because without it, you couldn't practice any of the others. Without courage, you couldn't be kind. You couldn't be honest. You couldn't do right. Courage. It takes courage to speak to a powerful king knowing full well your life is at risk. It takes courage to boldly live on earth as it is in heaven. It takes courage to seek the call of God when the call of the world is often so much louder. So, what does it mean to be a Christian at this point in time? It means knowing who you are, your identity, having empathy for those around you, and it means being courageous to live differently. Let's pray. God, we thank you for your word and the way that it speaks across time. We thank you that you are eternal. And when we wonder about what it's like to live today, we remember that you are acting and moving in ways that we can't imagine across time, for all time. God, we thank you for inviting us into your story that never ends, inviting us to go deeper into an infinite God and an infinite love. Amen.